Oh, looks like switched.
Oh.
All you see is my shoulder.
Wait.
we can share the camera. That way we're not.
I don't know. All I see is me.
we can slide in and out of it.
Yeah. Okay. Good morning. I am Cindy Grady, and I am the Director of Grant Programs for the Wisconsin Department of Justice and our Crime Victim Services Unit. And our unit oversees the VOCA grant, the VAWA Stop and Staffed grant, and also a state-funded Sexual Assault Victim Services grant. And we're lucky enough to have our SAC housed in the Department of Justice as well. So we started this process, we started thinking about this process about 3 years ago in 2015 when we first received our increase in VOCA funding. We wanted to think about ways to allocate our VOCA funding to our subrecipients around the state and also try to get in new subrecipients that hadn't been funded before. And so we kind of did an internal, well, we did it ourselves, but kind of a needs assessment through a survey to kind of determine the needs of victim service providers around the state, where they thought their gaps were, what services were needed, and what they thought they needed as an agency as far as staffing, training, et cetera. And so once we gathered those results, we kind of thought about priority areas for our competitive funding announcement. We do competitive funding announcements or RFPs every 3 years for our VOCA grant program in Wisconsin. So typically, new agencies weren't able to get in because we typically funded the same agencies year after year to sustain them. And so once we kind of went through the first year or two of these grant years, we found that we didn't have the capacity or the expertise or the staffing to really extract any of that data that they were supposedly reporting on in a qualitative and quantitative manner, because they were addressing these priority areas that we determined, but we weren't able to kind of pull that information out in a good manner. So then when this grant opportunity came about, we thought it'd be a great idea to partner with our SAC because they have the expertise. Our grant managers, they're very good at what they do, but we just didn't have the capacity to do the data collection component or the evaluation piece of it. So we thought about embarking upon this project in order to effectively figure out how our programs or how our agencies were not just collecting their data, but also how they were reporting on it so that we could meaningfully allocate our funding again. We're doing another funding announcement or competitive RFP next spring for the 2019-2020 federal fiscal year. And so we wanted to be prepared with information about victims being served, what the quantitative data looked like, and also the quality of what they were reporting on in their quarterly program reports. So what we kind of figured out on our own actually was that data didn't seem to be a top priority for our subrecipients. We have, I mean, you know, as a nonprofit, and I used to be an executive director of a nonprofit, it's not a bad thing, but, you know, we have people in crisis. These agencies are always in crisis. And so doing the data piece of it, especially with the newly implemented OVC PMTs, it was this extra thing that they had to do, you know, when they were trying to get victims into shelter or, you know, whatever it was. So not that they didn't care about it, but you know, whatever they were reporting, it was like, oh, they would get to it, or, you know, we weren't sure about the quality of this data. And also, as an office or department, we did not incorporate much of what they were reporting on into kind of our programmatic management of our subrecipients. We wanted to. We really enjoyed reading the program reports. We enjoyed seeing the statistics, believe it or not, but we didn't have a way of kind of incorporating that into the bigger picture of providing subrecipients the help that they needed. We have 117 subrecipients, and we just have 3 grant managers for VOCA specifically, so we just didn't have the time to kind of do that. And also the lack of quality data. So as I mentioned, if it's not a priority for some of these agencies, or they might not have a specific person in their agency to report the statistics, it might be the executive director reporting on the statistics. And, you know, so it wasn't a top priority, so we were concerned about the quality. And I think with them reporting into the OVC PMTs, we wanted to make sure that what they were reporting on directly into that system was as true and correct as possible. So our solution was to, with this grant, was to better understand the data that they were collecting and the collection process. And I mentioned in 2015, when we kind of first started thinking about this, we actually had a work group to discuss the OVC PMT definitions and what that meant for subrecipients in Wisconsin, so that we could try to get them to report on the same types of things. You know, if counseling meant this, does it mean the same to everybody else? And especially with the other categories of victims served, what did that mean? We wanted to make it as consistent as possible. And then we also wanted to utilize what we learned as a state for their reporting and help them kind of manage what they were reporting as well, so that we could, again, kind of have a meaningful way to allocate our VOCA funding. So some of the activities that we're doing, we are assessing the data that is presently being collected. So we organized focus groups. We did 6 focus groups around the state. I think we'll get to that slide in a minute. We wanted to hear directly from them, and then we wanted to hear from other states on what they were doing as far as data collection and what they were doing as far as program reporting for the qualitative information that they were getting or reporting on. And of course, our goals to improve the data quality, qualitative data, quantitative data, making sure that what people were reporting on was as true and accurate as possible. Data sharing, so we wanted to be able to share information not just with our subrecipients, so if there was a way for us to somehow get all the data through OVC PMTs or the STARS, whatever it was, we wanted to be able to share that with our subrecipients. We also wanted to share that with our other state partners. We have other state agencies that administer like the SIPSA funding and some other RPE funding. So we wanted to share that information because we know that they're reporting differently across all funding sources. And even in-house, we administer VAWA and a state grant program, and the information collected from both of those other grant programs is different than what VOCA collects. And so we're trying to figure out a way to make that consistent and share it, and to use data to make evidence-based decisions at a state and local level. So again, figuring out where the gaps and needs are in the state or what people are reporting on for their data and their services, and then to make kind of an educated guess or an educated guess around where we wanted to allocate our funding. That way we could do it in a meaningful way. Again, not to like take funding away from different agencies or certain areas in our state, but to really think about where the unmet needs are. And we keep telling people that we have enough money with VOCA to where people won't lose it, but we want to address those areas where the needs are unmet. You want me to still go through this?
I can talk about focus groups. So we did focus groups at 6 sites around the state. Well, not 6 sites. We did Dane County, where Madison, the capital, we did that twice. So those are your sort of your regional sites. We chose these sites because they were centrally located for the subgrantees. We got people together in a room just like this, sat around, and we talked. It was a semi-structured environment. SAC staff ran it. We decided not to have the OCVS folks run the focus groups because we wanted a neutral party to be the ones running it, and so they didn't really know us. So I ran a couple focus groups. Our director ran a couple. And we came in where we wanted to have an open conversation, and they could say, well, we're not liking the feedback that we're getting from OCVS, and they could feel like it was a safe environment, right? And they're very, as you all know, they're very sensitive to these sorts of issues. So I think we carried that through very well. We got a lot of really good feedback about things, that they liked about the program reporting, about the data. We got some feedback about things that maybe they thought could be improved, and OCVS was present and taking notes, and we compiled all those notes into a report that was a deliverable under this grant. In general, they really like qualitative reporting. They were, they didn't see a lot of value in sort of the numbers that go into things like the PMT. It's really output-based, and it doesn't capture things like service complexity. So certain cases are very complex cases. They, certain victims have lots of unmet needs, and they're, they receive sort of time-intensive and labor-intensive services, and they feel like that's not captured in numbers. So duration, service complexity, impacts, those sorts of things are not really captured. They felt sort of like the qualitative reporting that they report in our state e-grant system, so our sort of internal program management piece. They kind of like that platform for that sort of information. In general, we talked a lot about the record systems that they use. Lots of them are using Osmium. There were some others. There were some people using legacy systems. There were some folks using things like Excel, spreadsheets, or paper records. And so we did a lot of talking about sort of how they're collecting their data, when they're entering it, when they're tracking it, when they're uploading it, when they're doing analyses on that data or data quality checks. When does that happen? Does that happen quarterly when they're entering, their PMT data, or are they doing it like weekly? Do they have a staff person devoted to that? And so we really wanted to have a really good sense of sort of how these different these different subgrantees were tracking this data, collecting it, interacting with it, and using it also on the back end. There wasn't a ton of satisfaction with the record system. We'll get back to that in a minute. Even those that had sort of the state-of-the-art, I guess, record system, which is Osmium, seems to be sort of that's the go-to in the state. They didn't seem overly enamored, to say the least. So we'll come back to that at the end. But they also wanted to see their data put to use. So they wanted more feedback for things like the quarterly reports. And they also, a big issue is these people have funding from lots of different grants, right? VOCA, for many of them, VOCA is only a piece of it, maybe 50% or less of their funded activities are coming out of the VOCA grant. So when they're reporting these numbers, right, they feel like it paints an incomplete picture, and so that really limits sort of the utility of the data for them. When they, they don't want to take this data to funders or to do outreach. Or any grant applications. It's not really useful to them because they feel like it doesn't capture what they're doing. It captures what they're doing with VOCA dollars, but it doesn't capture what the agency as a whole is doing. So that's a really tough issue to sort of struggle through is how do we make this data useful to them, because if they see value in it, that creates a motivation for them to provide quality data, right? If it's just something that they're reporting because they have to report, then they want to have accurate data to the extent that it gets them funded, but beyond that, they're not using it. So if it's off a little bit, there's not a big motivation for them to have high quality data. Okay, and then we also were analyzing the existing data. This is something I spent a lot of time doing. The next couple slides will be some screen caps of some dashboards. There really are two data sources, or three, I guess, depending on how you want to think about it. We have the e-grants qualitative questions. They report on this to us at the Department of Justice on a quarterly basis. And these are really, they're just strictly qualitative questions. I'll put the actual questions up in a second. And then there's the PMT, and the PMT really has two pieces of data. There's the quarterly program report, and then there's the SAR, the Subgrantee Award Report, which contains the fiscal data that they're entering. They enter it within the first 90 days, and then they come back on the back end and update it. It sort of tracks how they spent their money and the funding allocations in the different categories. So we looked at all of that data. I'll start with some e-grant stuff. So e-grants, as you know at this point, e-grants is all qualitative questions. So there's not a lot you can do with qualitative data. So here's a nice word cloud. So it looks nice. So this is based on, they're asked to report on their activities for the previous quarter. So that's those are word pairs, most frequently occurring word pairs. And so we did some stuff like this with their e-grants data to sort of understand the content of the information that they're reporting. But most of the e-grant stuff was looking at sort of their responses. So this is the response length, and you can see most of subgrantees, their responses to these questions were right around 250 words, which makes sense. But then you have some subgrantees that are entering responses that are like 4,000 words long. And so when we started looking at the data this way and looking at average response length across questions, across subgrantees, you could start to tease out certain patterns Some questions elicited longer responses, some shorter, and so we started to think about, do we need to answer these questions or ask these questions every quarter? Maybe we ask them annually. We also looked at similarity scores to the questions. So those are the 8 E-Grants questions, and again, I'll put them up here in a second. You can see what they are. And so we calculated sort of the average, the similarity from one quarter, their response from one quarter to the next. So this is essentially duplicate detection. So they're histograms. So the far right side, the little bars poking up on the far right end, those are literally cut and paste responses. Those are people that are taking their quarterly reports and just cutting and pasting them from one quarter to the next. And you can see that behavior is a little more rampant on some questions than others. And the questions that seem to elicit more unique responses are the ones that sort of have the peak on the left side, right? So like question 1, which is asking, what are your activities, right? They are saying largely the same thing from one quarter to the next. And if you want to talk about how we did the duplicate detection or the similarity comparisons, I could talk about the calculations. It's real simple, but it's basically just looking at the ratio of unique words to shared words across the 2 quarterly reports. And so, but this is not necessarily a bad thing either. When you look at this, maybe they're doing the same things from one quarter to the next. Maybe it shouldn't change. I mean, but the takeaway I think is that they need guidance about this, because some people are putting a lot of effort into these program reports where they're trying to think up unique responses, right? And other people are just cutting and pasting, right? And so the reporting burden is not evenly distributed, and OCDS staff are reading through these things, and if they're going to be duplicated from one quarter to the next, they deserve to know that, because they don't need to read that every quarter, right? That's going to, I mean, that's a lot of wasted man hours. So we're trying to work through E-Grants and looking at these sorts of issues. I mean, there are other pieces in the data quality report, but I think these are a couple interesting highlights. Those are the questions. So the first question is real big, is just ask about activities. I don't want to go through all of these, but we also looked at the questions, and in particular the ones where there were a lot of really lengthy responses, trying to think about maybe these are double-barreled questions. Maybe we can piece these apart into separate questions. So we made some suggestions to OCDS about how they might be able to change some of these questions to elicit better responses. Some have asked for some quantitative data that's sort of embedded in the response. There's not a good way to get that out, unfortunately. I mean, there's numbers in it, but parsing that out of this like narrative that they're putting into E-Grant it's very tricky. And then there's the PMT data. So this is information from the quarterly. This is done in Tableau, and there are a whole bunch of dashboards that pull a couple screen caps of a few of those that I think are more interesting. This compares the number of their service recipients in a given quarter to their median quarter or their average quarter. We have a similar table that looks at growth from one quarter to the next, and you can adjust the dashboard. So I think right now it's set up so if the high outliers are quarters where the service recipients are twice as large, twice as many as the median quarter. The low outliers are boxes where the service recipients are half what the median quarter is. And so you can adjust that, and you can look to see if there are agencies where there are, outliers, where they're swinging around wildly in the number of service recipients from one quarter to the next. We also look to see if there was a peak occurring in the first quarter, because all service recipients are supposed to be new in the first quarter. So there's some dashboards looking at that to determine if they are in fact reporting all service recipients as new service recipients. The focus groups, a lot of subgrantees struggled with that. They had a hard time sort of tracking the data in that way. They didn't understand why it was done that way. And so there was some concern that maybe they weren't doing it that way. But I will tell you, looking at the data, actually it looks really good. There is consistently just a peak in the number of service recipients in the first quarter of every grant year. So, thinking about the PMT, just out of the quarterlies, there are sort of 2 pieces. One is sort of understanding the fiscal data from a overall perspective, like where is the money going, right? And that's not this dashboard, that's actually the next one I'll show you. And then the other piece is sort of looking at subgrantee-specific data. So, if we're going to do a site visit, right, with this agency, this is an agency that serves a tribal community. And if we're going to do a site visit with this agency, well, we might want to pull up some facts and statistics about this agency, see who they're serving, what their population looks like, what services they're providing. And so we created some dashboards looking at that information. And again, this is all based on the PMT data. So you could pull these reports up and you could say very quickly, oh, well, these are serving a lot of men, a lot of women. This agency is serving all the Native American population. And so that was it was what OCBS wanted, so we tried to create some sort of agency-specific reports. And so you could pull these for each of the 117 different subgrantees. And this is a dashboard looking at money spent. So this is sort of for OCBS to ensure that they are actually spending their funds, 10% allocated to each of the categories. And there are a couple different ways you can look at this, a percent of total or actual raw dollars. You can look at it over time. And the one interesting thing in this slide is there was this remainder, which is something I had to come up with as I worked with the SAR data. It looks like some of the funding totals in the service categories don't actually add up to the total award amount. So there's like a discrepancy there. And that discrepancy is what I stuck into the remainder. I'm not exactly sure what it is. So we're still trying to figure out exactly what, and it's a fairly sizable amount of money. I mean, so we're exploring that, but that was a data quality issue that we sort of uncovered as we were working with the SAR data. Okay, and then we did some mapping. There was talk about maybe putting out a map of service provider locations, and so this is an example of a map. You can click. It's at the city level. You can click on a dot, and it filters down to the agencies in that city providing services, providing for contact info. So anyways, just having a lot of fun with the sort of data that we had on hand, trying to understand it and work through it. I did mention we made some recommendations to OCBS. I have the draft of the report. I can't share that yet, but to summarize, we think subgrantees need more guidance and training on clarification on definitions for some of these things. Things like agency designation, right? So they pick an agency designation in the SAR report. We don't think they're doing that in a consistent way. And the unfortunate thing is when we want to look at funding allocation across like agency types, that designation category can be really useful. But as it is, I don't think it's meaningful. So I think we need to work on sort of helping agencies understand, well, what is your agency designation? Looking at things like what counties they serve. So some agencies say, oh, we serve the whole state. And it's like, well, no, maybe you really don't. What does it mean? If you accept people from all over the state, okay, but if you haven't had a service recipient from that county, you really aren't serving that county. And so there's just not clarity on what these things mean. So I mean, we have, there's another map of, the number of agencies that are serving each county. But again, that's not really reliable data. As you get into it, we have real questions about that data. So again, resolving these issues through additional training and clarification on definitions. Revisiting the eGrants program reporting, we're exploring, expanding that system, enhancing it, building in more quantitative data into it, revising the qualitative questions, adding additional quantitative data to assess outcomes and impacts, because right now the quantitative data in PMT really is just outputs, which is different. And so we really want outcomes and impacts in addition to outputs. And then also discussing the possibility of a comprehensive statewide reporting system. That's sort of a a moonshot type project, right? But it's on the table and we're going to discuss it. And then, of course, expanding and enhancing OCBS. OCBS, they are understaffed. They've got a lot of money flowing through the office. They have a lot of things they want to do, but they don't have the manpower to do it. So I think that's an important piece, is advocating on their behalf, because there's a lot of potential here, but you need man hours to do it. You want to say something about the next steps?
Sure. I wanted to just quickly say a few words about the eGrants quarterly program reporting. We had an amazing intern over the summer who captured the first quarter of the 2017-2018 grant year and took a look at those questions that Will popped up a minute ago, and she also kind of extracted key words on a regular basis to try to figure out what were we asking and what were people reporting on. And so some of the recommendations from her, like as Will said, some of these questions were double-barreled. Some of them didn't even, some of the subrecipients didn't even answer these questions, or they would just say none and leave it there. So when our intern kind of took out that information and presented on it, it kind of gave a skewed response, because if we're asking, what are some of your external challenges, and at that quarter they put none, so it looks like, 50% have no challenges of, our subrecipients. It's like, well, you kind of do, but, so how do we formulate these questions so that we get a consistent response, and maybe it's separating questions into responses that that we can actually get information from and make recommendations on, because otherwise these program reports, we just read them and there's no way to kind of figure out what, we don't do anything with the answers most of the time, or the information that we get. A lot of it is helpful, but again, we want to minimize their time reporting and minimize our time reading these program reports. There's a lot. There's 117. So, and there might be more next year. So as Will mentioned, we want to kind of work with our existing e-grant system initially to kind of figure out a way if we can collect quantitative data in a better way that could potentially also interface with the OVC PMTs or the SART, because there's just a lot of different places that people are reporting, and so we want to collect it, analyze it, and report on it in an efficient and meaningful way. With all of this information, we do have the recommendations, and we kind of built in requirements for the next steps, and we hope to implement most of these changes for our next competitive RFP that's going out next spring, and so that would include the data collection pieces, the qualitative reporting in our program reports, and some other things. We're also embarking upon a needs assessment. Hopefully in the next couple of months, we're doing an RFP to get a consultant to assist us with doing a comprehensive victim services needs assessment. And so with that information, I know that other states have done that, and we tried to do it internally 3 years ago, and we just didn't yield all of the results. We didn't have the capacity to do really what we wanted. So hopefully we'll get a consultant that will come in and assist us with doing a really good needs assessment for the state. So then ultimately we can, if we do send out different VOCA RFPs, we can do it in a way that addresses where the needs are instead of just these big RFPs or funding announcements. So anyway, we're trying to look at a way to really focus our funding on areas where there are needs or gaps.
I know we're a little tight on time, but I do want to have questions for Arizona and Wisconsin now before we forget them. But before we do that, I neglected to have Peter introduce himself. Peter, can you let people know? Okay, do we have any questions for the Arizona team? Including people on the phone. You can unmute yourself if you have a question. Anything about their struggles with identifying service providers, the fact that they have a decentralized system that they're trying to work through, behind the eight ball.
I have a question. So, the decentralized, and forgive me, I don't work as closely with the VOCA agencies. I'm on the discretionary side of the shop. And OVC. So, how many agencies on the state level are administering your VOCA funds? No? Okay, that's that.
Yeah, and those are the ones that they sort of self-identify, but we're kind of hoping will come out of this report as well, is if other people are getting money and they're not part of this, that they'll feel left out. And they'll be like, okay, by the way, this should also be part of this discussion. So, yeah, it's 8 agencies that we know of.
Okay.
But there could be more getting little pieces of pie.
Okay, and that's both the victim assistance and victim cost, right?
Yeah, so some of the, CPS is the largest share, I think, or CPS is so the Department of Health is the biggest piece of that pie. And then there's the governor's office of youth and family gets money for, I know they do domestic violence work, and housing, our Department of Housing gets a little bit of money to help out. So there's people with smaller slices, but yeah, we think we have most of it. But we'll kind of see as we try to push this out and get the report out and visible if there's other agencies that really should be in the table, because even within their own coordinating team, they don't know.
I think we'd love to hear what happens when you present these findings.
Yeah, that would be interesting.
questions for Wisconsin? I don't really, it's not a question. Okay.
What did you say? Oh.
Oh, boy.
Yeah, I recommend it. Okay. Yeah.
You did very good.
Yes, I had a question for Wisconsin. So I know Arizona mentioned that once you were explaining, here's where these things are going. I don't know if in your focus groups or in your recruitment, if you also had to kind of say, we're going to give you the results and we're going to talk, like, here's where things are going. So this is why we're asking.
Yeah.
They were really interested. I mean, they were we didn't have difficulty recruiting people. The focus group stayed filled right up, and we're having to try and shift things around. We had to do another one in Madison because everybody's kind of used to driving to Madison for things. So they were really eager to give feedback, I think. So that was really good. But they also, I mean, not just the focus group, but more generally with data. They wanted feedback. They wanted to see that data put to use. They wanted, ideas about how they could be using the data better. And so that was a big one. And then they also wanted to see the results of the focus groups, right? And so we have a write-up, and we're planning on disseminating that back out to the sub-agencies.
And one thing that came up in the focus groups that we're already implementing is that most agencies did not like the quarterly program reporting in our e-grant system because, again, they were saying some of the same things over and over and over. And so now that we have, we administer the 3 major grant programs, we switched to a semi-annual kind of reporting for this now grant year. And we're going to implement that with our VAWA and SAVE funding as well so that people, hopefully, we'll see how this works, can think about what they did over those past 6 months if they can track that easily. Sometimes people are better at quarterly reporting, sometimes people are better at the semi-annual, but sometimes I think what we heard is that in the focus groups that the quarterly reporting was too much and they didn't have to do that and the penalties and all of that stuff. So we're implementing that now and they're pretty happy about that so far.
All right, thank you. Oh, wait.
I have a couple questions, actually. Katie, you were talking about your arrest analysis and commented on Arizona is not very far along with libraries. But I was just curious, maybe if you could comment a little bit more about, because I don't know if you have like some agencies reporting libraries and not others, or if everything we're grabbing is from summary statistics or that, or just curious about that, and maybe with the if you comment on that would be relevant for other people to hear about as well.
The data that we get from CPS is just the UCR, we get the ACP, Arizona computerized criminal history records, and so we get the arrest records. But some agencies, there's been a handful that have made this switch over to NIGRIS. The problem is CPS is the state repository for all of the arrest records, and they haven't updated their system, so they can't get in any. So for the few that have done the NIGRIS transition, they, I believe in January, they're supposed to be getting a contract, or the contract is signed to update their system so that they can start receiving that data. So we're, 2021 is a long way away. Even then, it's going to be a while.
And I was just going to also say, I thought your qualitative analysis that you did was fascinating. And I just had a quick question. I was curious what kind of software you're using to do the analytical work.
Yeah, so the qualitative, like text analysis stuff and e-grants, I did that in R.
Okay.
R, which is free. Rather R. Do we?
There is a lot of interest in learning more about it and seeing applications in it. That's come across a lot. So.
I didn't know these guys on it, so it would be helpful to know that other SACs are using R and without questions on them?
We're exploring. We're exploring it. I've been the guinea pig, and this project actually was a test project for using R. So in our bureau, we're looking at transitioning, and it wasn't my idea. So I was a STATA user. I came in, we had SPSS, and I said, I don't want SPSS, and they said, well, how about R? So we're experimenting, and so this project was a good test case for like, well, what can we do, with it? And it's, so I've been learning it, and I think we're going to transition to it. But yeah, I'd be interested. We could talk. Sure.
Yeah, I think there's been a lot of interest in some from BJS about kind of, I don't want to say marketing this, but getting out information more about this amongst the SACs. I think we've included it on the agenda in one of our regional training institutes. So I think we're following up and maybe trying to push this a little bit more.
Thank you. One question. Did you do the same analysis for the annual EMT sort of their outcome measures that they have at the end of the quarter or the end of the fiscal year? Did you analyze that?
You mean the global data that's not agency specific?
It is agency specific, yeah. It's like at the end of the fiscal year, there are annual questions that some grant team answer. They call them outcome measures, but like you mentioned, they're really outcomes. They ask about, do you have a satisfaction survey?
Oh, right, yeah, okay. And we didn't look at that.
Challenges.
No, okay. I saw the report, but I don't think we pulled the data. So it's based on the SAR data export, and then the quarterly data. We exported all the quarters and then compiled those.
Right.
But yeah, no, I don't think we pulled the I know there are extra annual questions.
Yeah, I haven't looked at those too close.
Yeah.
All right, thanks again to our first two teams.